Good evening, everybody. My name is Maria Balinska, and I'm the Executive Director of the US-UK Fulbright Commission. Our vision at the Commission is a world in which there are no obstacles to learning, understanding, and collaboration, which is why we're so excited that technology now enables unique opportunities like this one to bring together Fulbrighters from both sides of the pond, wherever they may be sitting, to exchange their ideas and their insights. And I'm very excited for tonight's event to hear what our all-star panel of American and British Fulbrighters think about the future of the arts as we look forward to 2021 and to vaccines that hopefully are going to mean a return to at least some kind of social and creative interaction. This has been an incredibly challenging time for the arts, particularly the performing arts, with theaters on Broadway, for example, closed until the spring, and the new tier system here in England severely restricting public gatherings for the foreseeable future. At the same time, as we all know, and though us non-artists know particularly, the arts have played a hugely important role in keeping us all going over these months, from online choirs and virtual painting lessons to Zoom-based dramas and drive-in operas. So it feels very appropriate to be doing this discussion today on the eve of Thanksgiving to pay tribute to the arts world in general. And with that, I want to get out of the way and hand over to our moderator, Ade Solanke, with a brief introduction to Ade, who is an award-winning playwright, a screenwriter, and an academic. Her acclaimed debut play, Pandora's Box, was nominated for Best New Play in the Off West End Theater Awards. She has an MFA from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, where she was a Fulbrighter. She's a produced screenwriter and was a semi-finalist in the Academy's Nichols Screenwriting Contest and a story analyst for Sundance, New Line, and Disney. She's also an active and very much appreciated member of the Fulbright Alumni Advisory Council here in the UK. Ade, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ade Solanke, your chair. It's a huge pleasure to be here. And it's a greater pleasure to actually welcome this fantastic panel we have lined up for you. Our panel brings together American and British Fulbrighters to talk about our topic, as you know, is the future of the arts in a world with COVID. Yes, we've had months of lockdown and the economic slump which has followed is still ongoing. And the good news of the viable vaccine has injected a dose of optimism, which we'll be bringing into our conversation, but we know the challenges are formidable. Is this a new world order? We as artists come up with all sorts of world scenarios and build all sorts of realities, but I think it's fair to say 2020 has, let's say, trumped us. It's been more than we could ever have imagined. And in the world of culture, 2020 has seen festivals cancelled and theatres and clubs closed and thousands of jobs lost, and actually $1 trillion of global creative industry turned upside down. The way we were, for example, in London, in 2019, London's creative industries generated around 58 billion. That's changed. Recently, Justine Simmons, who is the Deputy Mayor for Culture and the Creative Industries in London, chaired the World Cities Culture Forum. They had their first ever digital conference. 40 cities came together over 12 time zones to share the challenges. And it was a gloomy picture, as you can imagine. A recent survey gave up some statistics like this, a survey of global cities. 84% of cities are concerned about the loss of cultural tourists. 77% are worried about the permanent closure of venues, and 69% are concerned about freelance artists and creative professionals leaving their industry and or their city. So all those vital elements of the equation, the creatives, the cultural spaces, and as importantly, the audiences are going to be discussed tonight. One statistic from an art form that's not represented on our panel, the music business, which obviously has recorded, but also a very strong live dimension. The UK Music, the umbrella organization for the field, says last year the music industry was worth 5.8 billion to the economy, UK economy. But they calculate that with the impact of the coronavirus, that will plummet to about 3 billion. So bad news, but also lots of ways in which we can move ahead and to address these issues and discuss all the different areas of different aspects of this issue. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We have Román Baca. He is a classically trained ballet dancer, a US Marine, Iraq War veteran, artist and academic. He co-founded and directs Exit 12 Dance Company. He's a researcher at the Trinity Laban Conservatoire, where he did his MFA during his Fulbright year. And he's also a junior research scientist with the USAF, USN Research Unit. He was awarded the Selma, Jeanne, Cohen Dance Lecture Award for his research into the dance industry and the military. Our second panelist is Sharon Elizabeth Doyle. Sharon has a BA and MFA in theatre from Cornell and was a playwright. I'm waiting for the images to catch up. I think Rowan's are still on there. Yeah. Sharon was a playwright until she started screenwriting for PBS. A show called Working Woman prepared her to write Cagney and Lacey, one of my favorites, I still remember it well, on CBS. And she wrote many issue-orientated series and TV movies, as well as teaching screenwriting at USC, where I studied. And she was a 2014-15 Fulbright Scholar at the University of the Arts in London. And last but not least is Jacqueline Donachie, who is an award-winning Scottish artist. She exhibits widely. She's a trustee for a number of organisations and also is an advisor to Scottish Government Creative Industries Board. Her work is held in many national and international public collections, including the Tate and the Arts Council. In 1995-6, she spent a year in New York as a Fulbright Scholar at Hunter College. So welcome everyone, it's an enormous pleasure to have you here with us. I want to start with a global question, if I may, for all of you. As creative artists, what's changed in your personal practice since COVID hit earlier this year? If we go to you first, Román.
Being a dance artist and a choreographer, COVID has definitely directly impacted the way we work. I think we've had to shift completely to virtual rehearsals utilizing Zoom. And we've also had to rethink logistics around how to get our creations to our audiences. I think one of the opportunities that COVID has given us is a broader reach, in that we can now reach people with our content almost anywhere in the world. And we've also been able to reach more of our constituents. We work a lot with military veterans, and two of the arts organizations that I've been working with have been able to pivot and offer online workshops in theater and arts for veterans who are stuck at home, who are isolated, and who are vulnerable due to COVID. So definitely a couple of challenges and yet some opportunities as well.
Thank you. Sharon. Sharon seems to have disappeared momentarily.
Here I am.
Hi.
I spent the first 6 months telling everybody that my life hadn't changed. You know, I get up in the morning, I get a cup of coffee, and I go write something. And I did actually, you know, complete a novel that I had been working on since my Fulbright years in 2015. But then, and this is happening apparently to a lot of writers, the depression, there's a huge problem with depression, the sense of just futility of it, and then the day expanding. It's always difficult to write anyway.
Yeah.
It's twice as difficult to write without an end in sight, a purpose, a framework. And since in television for sure, you know, development is at a standstill, and a lot of people saw their projects go up, you know, sort of get postponed or stopped. The other aspect of this, and I just want to speak briefly about it, is we have this thing in America, which is also in Egypt and in Jordan, not so much in the US, who rely more on the single writer, but we have the writer's room. And Zoom is a disaster for the writer's room. It's a disaster for anybody involved in improvisation, where you rely on a sense of the room to build excitement and stuff. Whereas, you know, Zoom is one person is talking and you can't read the room. You can't, there is a collaborative aspect of writing for television, which has been severely impacted by, and as a result, I think that the number of writers involved in actually developing the stories, developing the backbones of the series is going to lessen.
It's similar to the actors who would normally assemble to rehearse. As writers in a writer's room, you would gather to develop. Thank you. And where is Jackie? How has your practice been shifted?
Well, my practice changed quite dramatically at the beginning, because I was about a month away from opening a big public art commission in Glasgow. So I had two big commissions that were scheduled for this year, one that was opening at the beginning of May and one that was opening in September. The one in May was in Glasgow, called Glasgow International. It was a project that involved a lot of concrete casts, and we had made the molds, and we were literally days away from pouring 3 tons of concrete into these molds because they have to cure before they get put out. I was working with a musician. There was quite a big event, and then in September I was working towards another big public art event in Folkestone called the Folkestone Triennial. So both of them were just suddenly moved by a year. Yeah. So there was an immediacy in that I'm freelance, but I also work with universities. So the freelance side of my practice, I pay a lot of people to do work for me, and then I get the money back in, and then it all gets paid out. So I had paid out like tens of thousands of pounds for people who were working. And so we had the people I was working with are a small group of kind of younger artists. So we had quite a job, as many freelancers did, to get back any of the money that a lot of the funding, you don't get it until the project's finished. Suddenly the project's made 1 year longer. Oh. You still have to feed your kids and pay your bills. And
the impact on freelancers has been especially cruel, hasn't it?
Yes, it's been really difficult. And also the people that work for me, I couldn't keep them on because the project, there wasn't enough money left in the budgets to extend the day and a half a week that my assistant does for another year, because there was only 3 or 4 days left in the project, and we had to keep that money for the project in the following year. So initially it was very full on, and on a personal level, there's a lot of people in my family have disabilities, which I also make work about. So all their care just stopped. So suddenly, within the space of a month, I went from being like full-time, very, very busy artist and academic researcher to sort of full-time carer for 5 people.
So that's going to have a massive impact on your productivity.
So then that settled down, and we've got used to the new dates for the exhibitions. And then I think, very much like Sharon says, the kind of slowness and the difficulty to focus on things. Like I've got a lot of stuff that my fellowship with Loughborough University is just ending. And that is supposed to be, you know, I had a lot of work that I was supposed to do for that I wasn't able to do because I couldn't travel anywhere. And with that ending, it's trying to kind of move on and look at how you're going to fund next year. So
it's an ongoing, and we don't have all the information that we need to even plan how to recover. But let's move on to just the next question, which we produce the work, but once we got it into the world, usually we've got established ways of sharing it with our audience. Román, how has COVID changed how and where your art meets its audience?
We've had to totally rethink it during COVID. We did a project in June where the logistics were pretty challenging. We had an artistic residency in upstate New York, and we took 5 dancers and had them all get COVID tested and isolate so that we could have our own insular bubble and actually work together. And while we were doing that, we had technological challenges that we had not anticipated in terms of sharing our work, because suddenly we're in this very remote area of New York and we're challenged with slow Wi-Fi, trying to work off of phone hotspots and get enough data so that we can send our work live to our audiences who are very interested in seeing it. We also partnered with 2 online art platforms to share our work to their audiences as well, and had 2 online showings. And again, technical problems were rife with both of those showings in terms of data and in terms of platforms like Facebook Live and Instagram Live that the presenters didn't really understand. And so it wasn't the best delivery of art that we could have done, but it was something.
But as a performance artist, how important is it for you to share the space with the audience?
I think it's extremely challenging to connect with people through the virtual platform. We were lucky in both of the online offerings that we had a small in-person audience. So we were able to generate some energy to and from that in-person living, breathing audience.
Yeah.
But as we look forward, you know, these COVID challenges are, like you said, have no end in sight. And we just got a grant to tour to New Mexico in the States. And we're having to constantly rethink how we're going to deliver whatever we create and whatever we do to the audiences out there, given the ever-changing COVID guidelines.
Yeah.
We're envisioning in-person, like you said, drive-in performances, a mix of in-person and virtual workshops, but we have a huge backup plan to deliver that whole offering virtually if COVID stays the way it is right now.
There's no knowing. Jackie, as an artist, as a visual artist working with physical objects, how has it changed how you engage with your audience?
Yeah, I think for me, the projects that I was working towards, in a way, I'm quite lucky because they were both public, mainly public works. So I have quite a strong feeling that they are still going to happen because they're outdoors. How I make them is going to be quite difficult because one of them, I quite often work with other groups to help me make my films or exhibitions. And the project for Folkestone involved working with a group of older women dancers to be together in one space and be filmed doing this quite traditional Scottish social dance. So at the moment, that's actually illegal to gather older women in a space.
You mustn't break the law.
Yeah, so I'm having to rethink how I might do that. But like Roman, having to think, well, if this happens, I can do it like this. And if this happens, I can do it like that. But for other colleagues who had exhibitions within galleries planned, I know that people have just had to totally reprogram things, and some shows were just dropped. Some exhibitions just can't happen because they haven't got enough programming space to move everything to next year.
And what about the question of how audiences' attitudes may have changed to just gathering, coming together to enjoy visual art? What's your sense of how the audience is feeling about?
I think people have a really strong desire to be able to go back and see art. The institutions that opened again, people were so happy to be able to go back, even though they had to book and they had to go in a time slot. So that spontaneity has gone. But what we really are missing is the more event-based art events. It is something that I really thrive on. I mean, that's what I love doing. If I was only going to make small works in galleries, I don't know if I would have stuck at it for so long, but there's a kind of crossover with what I do, where it's very much about gathering people together. So the prospect of that not happening, which for a while seemed, you know, it was really impossible to imagine how things could fully go back to the way they were before. Now with the vaccine, there's a chance, but you know, art openings, I'm sure you've all been to art openings, and they're such a spectacularly brilliant thing in themselves because you have people there and you have all the energy around the new work that's being unveiled.
It's the social interaction from the gallery.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I think some artists do thrive on that isolation situation, but not so many of the ones that I know, and certainly not me. So the prospect of just making things that one person at a time books to go and look at in an empty space is quite difficult, actually. It's very difficult to imagine.
Sharon, can I bring you in? Has COVID changed your attitude to consuming dance or visual art, or even your own art form?
Well, I think that, there have been some events on Zoom, like, for instance, the cast of The Princess Bride got together and read the script as a fundraiser in Wisconsin. And there was a sense of just, waiting to hear Wallace Shawn say that line, or whatever it was. And the ones you could tell which, and it was charming. And other things have happened that are charming, but it doesn't replace actually being there. And the example I always use is there was an old horror movie called Carrie, and I went to see it. And I remember the guy outside the door said, "I'm going to count down from 10. And that whole theater is going to scream." And we all went, yeah. And he did it. And the entire theater screamed. And we all know what that moment was, if you know the movie. Her hand comes out of the grave and grabs the woman. That's the kind of theatrical and emotional experience that we're going to miss. And I don't see how
we gather when we come together.
Yeah. And I think in the sense of the water cooler, everybody going to the water cooler the next day and saying, "Did you see what happened on Stranger Things last night?" And sharing that with each other. Certainly, we're all sharing series experiences with each other. My kids are saying, "Oh, you got to watch Queen's Gambit," and things like that. So there's that kind of conversation, but it's not the same.
And it's not the same as going into a theatre to see, Román's dance, or going into a gallery and others enjoying Jacqueline's art. This question of how we're artists, but we're also consumers. I haven't been into a theatre for 9 months. I was in a cinema at the BFI London Film Festival, I think 2 months ago now, at a socially distanced screening, and there were like 2 or 3 seats. They'd taken out certain seats, so there were 2 spaces between myself and the people who were on my row. And I actually felt very safe. I wasn't apprehensive at all. But what's your sense of how, if you like, the culture is feeling about going back into the shared experience of consuming arts? Román, how do you feel about your dance audiences?
I think they're split down the middle. I think you have those individuals that are aching to get back into the theater and think that the restrictions and the rules are a bit of an overkill. And then you have those individuals who are happy to be isolated and following the rules and wearing masks and essentially thinking about the greater good. And I think, as much as I know I ache and my dancers ache to get back into a shared space, I also know that the community that we work with, the very at-risk community who have injuries from service or lungs from burn pits that are vulnerable to this disease, that we respect them by waiting and being patient and observing the rules and going back when it's okay.
Yeah, we love art, but we love life too. Absolutely. Jackie, you mentioned your work with cultural, I think the Scottish Cultural Industries Council. The economic impact of all of this has been, I quoted one statistic from the music world. What does it look like in terms of the visual arts?
I think the biggest impact within visual arts has been with freelancers. So many people in visual arts work freelance, as in other creative industries, and also within the kind of gallery sector. And the biggest problem, I think, at the outset of it for the arts in the UK, I can speak sort of more of Scotland, but it's universal, is how threadbare funding was before this hit. I mean, everything had been so pared back. There was no slack. There's nothing left that can be taken out of creative commissioning and running galleries. Most people, Creative Scotland are very, very good, and they have been very good within the crisis time, but they're limited to the budget that they have from central government. And organisations, a lot of organisations have been operating on standstill funding for like 5 years. So there's so little room to give before this even hits that I think that's where the impact, that's where it's been sort of so hard to navigate. And I think the other thing that's become really clear that we've been trying to pass on as freelancers who speak back to the like Scottish Government Creative Industries panel that I sit on is how interconnected things are. So although you've got a list of kind of freelance artists, some of those artists also work in galleries as attendants, or as I think in the US you call them docents, if I remember rightly from my time. You know, they work on the installation crew. They work 1 month out, they work for a week every 2 months to install the exhibitions. People's freelance economies are very, they're pieced together across a number of areas. So when one thing goes, it affects the next thing. So everything has a real knock on. And I think that's where the emergency funding packages that have been put in place, I think this also really has affected the music and theatre industry, because people are freelancing. You maybe earn a good pay for like one project, and that keeps you over like 2 or 3 months, and then you get your next one. So you can eke it out. So the big losses, for some groups, are things like the Edinburgh Festival being cancelled. So people can earn their money there for the whole of the following 3 months. Likewise for over sort of Christmas to New Year. So some people, you know, they earn money in blocks. It's been quite difficult to, these funding packages that have been put in place don't seamlessly replace what income has been lost and that will go on into next year when the furlough scheme ends. I think the impact has been how interconnected everything is, and how much freelancers have tried really hard to piece things together, perhaps avoid, a lot of artists I know have had to sign on, they've had to get universal credit because they just didn't have enough income coming in to be able
and
to.
The support for freelancers was a little bit tardy in coming, wasn't it? So they didn't get.
I think the government scheme, the fact that you had to have 3 years worth of accounts, you know, your accounts show your profit, so that doesn't take into consideration the money that you spend renting your studio. You know, I pay rent for my studio to Glasgow Sculpture Studios. If I don't pay my rent, they can't make their bills. So that your profit is like 80% of your declared profits being replaced doesn't really replace the money that you have to outlay, because you can't give up your studio because you still need to make work and you still have commitments. Although many artists have had to give up their studios because that was one of the first things to.
So with us as writers, Sharon, how do you feel what's the impact been? We, as a television writer, we know that streaming, Netflix and their peers have not enjoyed, but they've been experiencing a boon because we're all at home. But what has it been like overall with cinematic storytelling and other sectors?
Well, I think that the transition to streaming is now final. The broadcast, you know, it has become now a 24-hour, 20, you know, all the way around the world business. Netflix has gone, and you know, they've developed series in India and series in Jordan, and so there is that continual stream of work. But freelancers always lose, because in a straitened situation, you turn to the people, especially in a situation where you're not going to want to take a risk on $1 million movie, giving it to someone you don't know. There's going to be a contraction. And certainly in the arts in general in the States, there's been a lot of movement. For instance, in California, the creative arts group that was in my little town had been invited into the city of Pasadena to give online instruction, that kind of stuff. So there's some creativity going on, but of course the United States is never supported the arts, so it's all left to private foundations.
Is it true that I mean, they say that half of the cinemas are still closed across the country?
More than, I don't know. I think cinemas are open.
Oh, okay. I read so. Okay. I
Well,
thought I
it
read
could be,
some of them.
it's not a statistic I'm familiar with, but it's also one of these things where all the film festivals are happening virtually. All the
Yeah.
writers' conferences are happening virtually. And so I went to one just a few weeks ago, and I went to a seminar I had absolutely no interest in, just to hear writers talking to each other about
Sure.
writing.
That's
You know,
something
'cause
you miss.
it's
Again, the communal aspect is lost. Well, we have got someone who's been doing some research about the arts generally and about the impact of coronavirus in terms of philanthropy and general funding. So Daniel is a former Fulbrighter. Daniel Fauner is with us, and I think he's going to share some of his insights. Are we ready for Daniel?
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, Daniel, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Fauner. I was a 2016 Fulbrighter at the University of Warwick studying cultural policy and management of institutions. Currently, I'm the Associate Director for Research at SMU Data Arts, which is a research center at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, where we study the nonprofit arts and culture sector to help empower leaders to better understand their operations and funding from different sources. So since the onset of COVID-19, we've looked at various aspects of the pandemic's effect. We did some early studies and surveys with organizations and found that we expect or estimating that the average organization will experience a 26% deficit, 26% of their expenses over the current fiscal year. And we also did work in New York City, finding that some of the most vulnerable organizations were smaller community-based organizations, and that artistic staffing specifically at these organizations were most affected by layoffs and furloughs, where over 1/3 of all artistic staff had been laid off or furloughed when we conducted that study. Additionally, when we've done some research looking at some of the government funding initiatives that we've seen, so in the US, we had the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a government program to encourage businesses in general to keep their staff on payroll.
Right.
And we found that over 6,000 nonprofit arts and culture organizations were able to support 115,000 jobs through that. Now that funding ran out in the middle of the summer and it hasn't been started up again. So there's real issues concerning some payroll and employment in that regard. There are other bills currently in US Congress trying to find funding, especially for performance venues through the Save Our Stages Act or component of the HEROES Act. It's sort of stalled right now with a lot of negotiations in DC right now. And then similarly, you have some of the funding things in the UK through the Cultural Recovery Fund, the £1.57 billion initiative, and how that's rolled out recently. Lastly, I'll mention we've done some research in partnership with two firms, one in the US called TRG Arts and a firm in the UK called Purple 7, where they're studying box office data of organizations in both countries to provide insights to those participating organizations and give a broad understanding to what's going on in the sector. And here are a couple of the highlights that they've found. Ticket sales have greatly reduced for all buying types in both places, obviously, but some of the greatest decline has come from older audience members.
Which makes sense because the vulnerability. Yes.
Compared to 2019, ticket sales in the US have dropped 84%, while in the UK, that ticket drop was 91%. So a lot of performing arts. And then when we think about the contributed revenue side, there was individual giving drops in both the US and UK. Now, more specifically, given that the differences in the philanthropic culture between the US and the UK, in the US, while the number of donations increased by about 15%, the value fell by over 24%, or about $328 on average per gift. And in the UK, the count of donations fell about 35%, with value dropping by 11%, or about £13 per donation. So those are the main things that we've sort of been seeing through our research and continued surveying. And we found that really the best way that organizations are connecting and staying alive through donations is through meaningful connections with their community and not just transactional occurrences between.
Yeah. It's that relationship, it's the bond, it's that sense of an ongoing cultural togetherness is the word I would use, just as the way in which we were I would regularly go to my local theatre, which actually I'll speak about this in a little while, has got a really interesting idea for beating COVID. I just wanted to quickly mention to our audiences, would you kindly put your questions as we go along in the Q&A box? We will come to you. We want to hear your thoughts and your experiences too. So we'll have another couple of questions for the panel, but please do go ahead and put your questions into the section into the Q&A. Daniel, thank you so much for those statistics and for that overview. Very, very useful. In all of this, we know that there are people who, as Jackie mentioned, already were experiencing really straitened experiences. Diversity has been part of our conversation in the arts for many years. And in the last year, we've begun to see some inroads made, for example, in theatre. So when Corona hit in the UK sector, an open letter was sent to the Culture Secretary from Black and Asian and ethnically diverse theatre directors, artistic directors and cultural leaders, just stressing to him the importance of protecting representation. And this was in May 2020. They said to him, the COVID-19 crisis threatens all aspects of the theatrical ecology, but catalyzed by the revelations of the racial disparity in the health crisis. This group of Black, Asian and ethnically diverse artistic leaders call on the government and the sector to ensure the progress we have collectively made does not fall by the wayside. And it's true also in terms of women's work beginning to make some impact. But how do we see the impact of Corona on these gains we've made around diversifying the arts world? Jackie?
Well, I think, without being too pessimistic, I think that is quite catastrophic, particularly for women. I think yesterday I was at the launch of a report by the Freelance Foundation, who are a London-based organisation, and they commission every year a report on the representation of women in the arts in the UK for contemporary art. And it's done by a great researcher called Dr. Kate Mcmillan. And at the discussion yesterday, she was saying she's also doing parallel research around artists in COVID. But she said within the artists that she's working with for her research, there's an absolute split down the middle between artists that have children and artists that don't. And the artists that don't have children, men and women, have been using the time to, maybe they couldn't use their studios, but they've been able to kind of, you know, diversify, think about new things, read a lot of books. The artists that have had children, for the first sort of 4 months where there was no schools and no childcare, not even grandparents were allowed to assist with childcare, and that does predominantly fall to women, and it affects men and women, but it is predominantly women who are the kind of last resort for childcare. So those women haven't been able to make any work. And if you look at the statistics already of women's representation within the art world, the report for 2019 is showing small improvements in certain areas, but then you take in 2020 where everybody, you know, anyone who had caring responsibilities, right back down again. So I think that diversity also reflects right through with, I mean, it's very British to talk about class and income, but if you have got some form of independent income and you're not reliant on what you earn as an artist to push through with your career, you're not going to stick at it. You're going to jack it in and
it's tough enough. It's
hard enough.
In terms of access, the thing I mentioned earlier, the new person, if you're going to shrink the writer's room, the first person out the door is going to be the new person, the one who's aspiring to write. The people who are, we have programs in Hollywood through the Writers Guild, through the DGA, through everything for women, for minority writers. And that is, I'm afraid, going to become less of a concern as, you know, the creative process shrinks down just for the next couple of years at least.
Yeah.
Because it's difficult. Again, to form relationships over Zoom, you know, and people are going to rely on people that they know when they say.
Yeah, it's that last hired, first fired, which we've heard of before. The interesting thing is that the greater diversity, harnessing the talents and skills of more people, paradoxically ensures better economic outcomes for all. I think this common fear that given giving a person means and opportunities to advance detracts from those who've already had that privilege, and that, you know, access to human rights is correlated with broader economic development. And I think there are several studies that highlight that removing inequality barriers actually increases GDP. I think a recent McKinsey report showed that women
Well,
would add trillions of dollars to the economy if they were given equal opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's, if you're dealing with something like The Mandalorian, which is $15 million an episode, the weight of the amount of money you are dealing with and responsible for makes people more conservative. And it's just a fact. And we have made huge inroads, huge. I was the only woman in the writers' rooms for the entire 80s and 90s, you know, and but I'm just saying that given the consequences of their decisions and given the need to shrink amounts, and it's not just first hired, first fired, it's, you know what I mean when I say we need this to have a dramatic, you know, turn at the end of this scene or whatever. You're not, you know what I mean? It's trust as much as anything else. It's I have worked with you before. It doesn't matter what color or ethnic group you are from. I've worked with you before. That's what I'm saying.
But that's where the existing privilege reinforces and keeps going to the same exclusionary practices. So I take your point. If you're spending 15 million per episode, you need to get it right. But at the same time, how will you develop those new voices if you're only going to the people who you believe can get it right, because they're the ones who've been given the chance to get it right all along?
Well, no, I mean, and I think we're going to continue to see the success of of the people who have been successful.
Yeah, I agree.
Them.
Can I just remind everyone to please do put your questions into the Q&A box. We have a few, but we'd love to have some more. I mentioned just a moment ago a theatre's unique response, I think, to the pandemic. Actually, my first play was on at this venue, which is just 10 minutes from where I'm speaking from. I live in Hackney, it's in Dalston. So the Arcola Theatre has announced a project, a venue, which they're calling Arcola Outdoors. As we know, we're likely to be living with Corona for some time, and they think, well, how can we find new and safer ways of working? And what they're doing is creating an outdoor space. It's flexible, it's going to be multi-purpose, and they will be using it to host live performances and screenings and installations. And they're actually hoping it will be open by, they say, December of this year. That sounds really optimistic. However, it's actually a space, as I say, my first play was on at the Arcola, and my first play was actually on in the space that they're now converting into this outdoor hub. It was called the Arcola Tent at the time. This was about 5-6 years ago. And they say by going outside, we're significantly reducing the risk of airborne transmission of the virus, and we're creating more space for social distancing, and significantly reducing the risk of droplet transmission too. So they're on it, they're doing this. They've got architects already hired to make this space a reality in the next few months, maybe more than 2 or 3 months, but by next year. Are there any other initiatives like this that we know of in the other fields that you're speaking of?
There are a lot of drive-in theaters that are being refurbished.
Yes.
Yeah, which were such a dying breed, drive-ins. So in a way, that's quite a nice thing. I haven't, the one I would like to see that I just realized in all the walking, we've all had to walk so much in our local areas, unused petrol stations. There's so many petrol stations that are sitting empty, and they are perfect for outdoor events. They're covered, they've got power, they've usually got flat tarmac surface. So I'm going to start, once I get my own commission underway and get some funding, I think petrol stations, there's a lot of it. If you start looking for empty, unused, out of use petrol stations, there are a lot. And a lot of them haven't been decommissioned, and they're halfway there. They've got cover. So I think there has to be a lot more attention paid to what we can do outdoors. I've done a few big public works in Norway, in other parts of Scandinavia, and they have the same climate that we have, except it gets 20 degrees colder. It's like Canada cold. but they have such an outdoor culture all year round. They just have better lighting, better clothes, better facilities to do it. And I think in the UK, we're going to have to just think a whole lot harder about how we activate outside spaces and how we gather, because they're going to get a vaccine for COVID-19, and then there's going to be COVID-20, and there's going to be COVID-21. So I think that idea of how infections are transmitted is something that could very well come back again. So I think looking at space.
One of my students had a film that made a ruckus at the Venice Film Festival. And I remember he sent me, the applause at the end and everything. And I kept thinking, oh, how sad, it's not a full house. And then I realized why. They were all in masks and they were all clapping. And it was, I think we will have to get used to some form of social distancing just to get people back in the theaters.
Yeah.
Not, because despite what you've seen on the American media of all the Trump rallies where everybody's cheek and jowl, that is highly unusual. And most people are very cautious about engaging in that kind of thing, even if the outcome is I don't know, a religious experience.
Yes.
But
it's interesting. I mean, in terms of the culture shift that we are living through, I read something recently from Gus Van Sant, the film director, on this question of the shift from the big to small screen. He said, well, it was only because of the economics. Big screens were a corporate necessity, he said. They were a distribution model designed to show a film to the most viewers. And now there's a new way, because we each have a device that we can hold in our hand and watch a movie on. It's called a phone, obviously. So he says, well, there's, there was no destiny as to why cinema ended up on the big screen. But he does make this interesting point. He says, it's a strange thing to be watching cinema on the same computer screen where you buy your groceries. So there's kind of demystification of the art, the culture, because you can now access it so easily.
Well, again, the small army that is required to make a film, I mean, it literally is, with every other episode's different crew, 100 people, all of whom have to be indoctrinated, all of whom have little badges as to what part of the set that they can go to. And that's going to increase the cost. But I do think the level of storytelling, the complexity of storytelling on television, whether it's BBC or the networks or Netflix, is become actually something quite good that has come out of this move home. Movie theaters, that we are basically seeing the equivalent of the 19th century novel. In something that goes on and can actually have a scope to it.
The episodic.
Well, it's not just, what does Lucy do this week that Desi gets angry at and then it's resolved in the end. There are these long stories that are being told. And I think that they also have a level of language that they didn't used to have. And so also can reflect very, very specific cultures.
Yes.
And I remember Netflix did this thing with Jeanne, and all my students in Jordan were like furious because they'd Americanized this essentially quintessential Arab monster. And I said, no. And then Jordan blew apart. I mean, it was very interesting what happened with that, because Netflix is learning some lessons. You can't go in and please your corporate masters at home and the country that you're in.
Local audience, yeah.
Yeah.
We have some questions. May I put to Román, who you've been a bit quiet, so I'm going to pull you back into this if you don't mind. COVID has reduced the amount that people can travel and move around the world. Do you think that the last year has made or will make artwork focus more on the local as a result? Kind of connected to the point Elizabeth Sharon's just been making.
I would love to say yes. I think from my experience, it's done the exact opposite. It's challenged all of the organizations I've been working with to push our work through a virtual platform and engage more people internationally.
Yeah.
And to give you an example, I think this is the first time that I've seen art reach across not only the US and the UK, where I've worked within, but we've been reaching veterans down in Australia. We've been reaching veterans in the Ukraine. And I think what's special about that is now that you're sharing this artwork from this very challenging experience of serving in the military and serving in war, you find a shared experience and you find a community across borders and an understanding that you couldn't get otherwise. And while, you know, it's a challenge for this community to stay local because there is no place to gather and to create art and to share that art, it's offering more channels to push that art out to international people who want to engage in these discussions and these art making sessions.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond?
I think there's the kind of the sort of tussle between global and local, because you can kind of effectively speak to anyone from anywhere in the world. Like, you know, Sharon's in California and I'm in Glasgow. You have this wonderful opportunity to communicate with people, but at the same time, you can't have two sets of friends round to your house for a dinner party at the moment. So it's kind of, or just to talk to people in a room, you can't kind of collaborate in the ways that we're used to. So I think I've attended some things that were on in London. So there was a thing called the Festival of Place that was on last week. There was usually at the South Bank. It's a big kind of architecture planning event. And I would never have gone down for that, but I was able to join it online and pay a reduced amount of money and dip in and out to some of the speakers. So I couldn't deny that was an advantage, that I would never have done that had it not been streamed online. But then you don't ever get the opportunity to interact with people in the way that you usually do at a conference or an event, because when you all go for coffee, you all switch off your microphone and go to your own kitchen. So I think some of the things that we've gained, I hope we will keep, because, you know, being able to attend talks in the evening, if you have children, for example, is a good thing, because you can't always go out every evening. So there are some things that I hope we'll keep, but I just think it can't wholly replace the active experience of being in the same room or the same situation as other people.
One thing I would say is that this forced staying at home has led people to explore things that they might not have explored before. I have a couple of friends of mine who are watching a Korean sitcom, and you know, they are just hysterical about it, but they're also learning something.
Yeah,
and
I mean, I definitely watched more television. I don't watch much TV, but
right. And I think that people are going, well, you know what? Oh my God, I can watch. There's not just BritBox.
Yeah.
Now I see French. You know, I discovered the French storytelling traditions when I was in London, because they didn't used to broadcast it, but now you can get it. And so I think that people are exploring the world from their living rooms to a certain extent, and the conversation is happening between families.
Yeah.
About, okay, so we're all going to sit down and watch something, because the communal experience has to come from somewhere, and having everybody glued to their phones is just
just picking up on that. We've only got a couple more questions. You as individuals, what apart from your own art form, which you obviously love, what other art forms have you turned to for solace over these last few months?
I hate to say it, but we actually watched the Wagner week at the Met.
What was that?
That was wonderful, and it was a tremendous gift. But it was like a week of Wagner is too much for anybody, I think.
You survived it. What about you?
My husband was pleased.
So one of the most amazing things that I saw was the Andrea Bocelli concert that he held in Milan, which was absolutely beautiful. But for myself, I've turned to writing. So there's a I just moved to London recently from New York. And when I was in New York, I participated in a writing group with Fordham University with a group of veterans. And they're all older veterans from Vietnam, Korea. And I think there's a couple of us from the OIF, OEF, post 9/11 veteran group. But now that I'm in London, I've been trying as hard as I can to participate in this veteran group and stay engaged. And it's wonderful because I'm engaging in not a new art form. I love to write, but I'm being challenged to not just perfect my content of what I'm writing, but perfect the way I'm delivering it. So it's been really fun to put pen to paper and to share experiences that way.
Great. And Jackie, have you explored, investigated any other art form you wouldn't ordinarily have?
I think I certainly have engaged more with television. I'm not that good. I watch the news and not much else. But I have three, I keep saying I have three teenage sons, but one of them's is 21 now. But when they were all back for lockdown, we did really force things that we would all watch together. So, you know, the youngest is 16 and the oldest is 21, and they're very diverse. The only thing usually that unites everyone is watching football, soccer, but that wasn't theirs. So we had we did movie selection nights where everyone got a turn. My kids are old enough that everyone had to watch what one person chose. So I certainly saw some gangster movies that I would not watch. That was good to see, and in turn we got them to watch things that they might not have, and I learned to play cards. I got quite good at Switch and a campsite in the Highlands, which I wouldn't have done before.
I have been going for 3-hour walks, which if you'd said to me before this you'd enjoy tramping around London for 3 hours, I'd have said, oh no, but I actually love now. I was in Highgate on Sunday, just ridiculous. I just walked for 3.5 hours. So yeah, it's not the arts, but it's a form of culture.
One thing I've been doing is reading with my grandson. He's 8 and he has to do book reports. So I'm the book report lady in the house with the parents at home who are trying to teach, you know, with the online thing. And it really has become a really charming part of my day, but also he's insisting that I learn how to online game. So I now have an avatar. Wow. And I play Roblox and I try not to kill people, which means that I'll never get points. But it really is, there is an aspect of this where people are learning things. My dog is very thrilled that I'm going for 2-mile walks and not 1-mile walk. But
and it's good exercise. We writers don't get out, we're too sedentary. Well, I'm going to wrap this up now, but before we finish, just checking if there are any other questions. Can I ask you each, we all love the arts, that's why we do the work we do, obviously. What would you, if I said, well, in these challenging times, please give us one word why you believe we will and must fight for the arts. What would your word be? Starting with you, Román, if I may.
Creativity.
Okay, thank you. And Sharon?
Heart. Heart is the only word that I can think of. They are our heart.
Yeah, thank you. And Jackie?
So I agree with the other two. And then I'm also going to say power, because I think the arts is what gives small voices power. And I think if we lose that, and I think we have to be so careful that we don't lose that, because that is a really important thing, that we all take great joy in hearing the voices of others. And if that goes, then the power goes as well.
I think those are absolutely brilliant words. And I just go back to the global forum I mentioned at the beginning, where they talked about what's happening, the impact of Corona on cities. And they said, culture is the oxygen of cities, their life and their soul. It creates jobs, obviously, we've talked about that, boosts economies and tourism, but also supports mental health. And frankly, it's really how we define, they say our cities, but we could say our lives. Our culture is our story. So in all those ways, the arts must survive if we're to survive as a species. Thank you all. You've been a wonderful panel. It's been a great discussion. My thanks to Román, Sharon and Jacqueline for their insights and expertise and their generous honesty about some of the more offbeat impacts of this moment on their lives and their work. I'd like to also thank Maria Balinska and Tom Chadwick and the Fulbright UK team for their help in organising and putting this all together. And obviously, I'd like to thank you, our guests, for being such a great audience. Thank you for the questions. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Last but not least, happy Thanksgiving. Thank you all very much and good night.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. It's been
Bye.
Thank you.